Greetings, students. We're now continuing our Bio 102 online course, and today's discussion is about the nervous system. What's the nervous system? Uh, Basically, the goal, the reason of existence of the nervous system is to form a communication and coordination network. In simple terms, to receive signals from the environment and to respond to them so that homeostasis is not shifted. As you see here in this picture, you see the classification of the nervous system. The nervous system includes the central nervous system and the peripheral nervous system, CNS and PNS. The central nervous system includes the brain and the spinal cord. That's it. The peripheral nervous system includes receptors and nerves, and there are numerous receptors and multiple nerves in the body which together form the peripheral nervous system. If you're not familiar with the term receptor is some structure which is at the receiving end of communication with the environment. For example, in the skin you have receptors of touch, receptors of pressure, receptors of temperature, receptors of pain. In your eyes you have receptors of vision, in the ears, in the inner ear you have receptors of hearing, and so on and so forth. So receptors together with nerves form the peripheral nervous system. The peripheral nervous system has two divisions. We classify or divide it into the sensory division and the motor division. The sensory or afferent with a division is responsible for receiving signals from the environment and then to signal from the body to the brain and spinal cord. This is the most important thing, direction. Where does the signaling go? In the sensory or afferent nervous system, it goes from the body, from various parts of the body, to the spinal cord and to the and to the brain. The other division is the motor or efferent with E, and it signals in the opposite direction, from the brain and spinal cord to the body. The motor division of the peripheral nervous system, in turn, is made of the so-called somatic branch, and it's actually the nerves that signal to the skeletal muscles. And the autonomic branch, or in some older textbooks you can see the term vegetative branch, but autonomic branch kind of sounds better. It signals to the glands, heart, blood vessels, digestive organs, etc., without our conscious will. See, the signals in the somatic branch of the peripheral nervous system go from the brain cortex, which is where we basically think and want something consciously, to the skeletal muscles. I want to touch my ear. So my somatic branch of the peripheral nervous system forms a signal in the cortex of my brain and sends it down the nerves to the biceps of my arm, which contracts, and I can touch my ear. On the other hand, the automatic branch functions without our conscious will. The signals begin in the deep subcortical areas of the brain, which are not under our conscious control, and go to glands, heart, blood vessels, etc. the basic uh, phenomenon which explains pretty much all the functions of the nervous system is the so-called reflex, the common feature of all functions of the nervous system. When some disturbance arrives, in this picture, you accidentally or maybe voluntary, I can't imagine that you can do it voluntary, but some people can, touch the flame of the candle, right, hot object. Of course, you feel pain, serious pain, and really, you feel it fast once you touch the flames. It hurts. Then a special special receptor, signals to the central nervous system. In this uh, uh, in this picture, it is the signaling is shown by a green line. It goes from the tip of the finger that touches the flame. That's where the receptors are. To the spinal cord through some it says cell body of afferent neuron, etc., then axon of afferent neuron, and then to the spinal cord. Right? So the direction of the signaling is from the periphery, from the fingertip, to the central nervous system. Then this report, in parentheses, about the disturbance is processed in the central nervous system. You see in the spinal cord there is a red symbol that shows the so-called interneuron. That's where the processing of the report takes place. And then a response is sent to the organ of the body, in this case muscle, via the afferent with E or motor nerve. You see here from the body of interneuron, from the place where the report was received and processed. A blue line goes to the biceps of the arm and it contracts. And the efferent or motor nerves make it contract. So the fingertip is removed from the flames. Right? So that's the result of the work of the nervous system. You sense the disturbance, and your nervous system takes care of it. It removes your body from the place where the disturbance is. All right. Then this beautiful picture actually details the work of the somatic part of the peripheral nervous system. You see, it shows the brain, big pink-colored brain, and you see it sends some signal which is shows it's on this picture. It is shown like some kind of a radiation from some antenna or something. That kind of like interspecies communication or intergalaxy communication in sci-fi movies. Where is the signal going? It is going to the motor neuron. See here, the body of the motor neuron is shown in purple, and from the body you see the appendages called dendrites going in all directions, and they receive the signals, and these dendrites transmit it to the body, and from the body of the motor neuron the signal goes down this long appendage called axon, and eventually to the lower leg muscles. Right? What do you think happens when your lower leg muscles receive this signal? Well, it depends on what particular group of muscles. The response can be a step forward, a step back, a step sideways, or lifting your leg, or kicking the ball, or whatever. So that's how the motor nerve part of the peripheral nervous system works, and particularly the somatic part of this system. Under your conscious will, so you think about turning your leg, right? And you can do that. But note that this is only about the somatic nervous system. The autonomic nervous system is very different. It is impossible to give it commands coming from the cortex of your brain. You cannot, for example, think, okay, from now on I want my heart to stop. Won't happen, right? Or you can think, what about my shoulder artery? I want it to become wider. Or what about my small intestine? I want it to stop doing the peristalsis, stop contracting and pushing the food down. That's impossible. You cannot do that, right? And why is that? Because again, in the somatic nervous system, the signal comes from the top portion of the brain cortex, where there are centers of thought, volition, conscious, etc. So purely human activities. And as the autonomic nervous system receives signals from deeper areas of the brain, which are not under the control of the cortex. They have their own controls, but it's not your thinking, it's not your volition. Okay, we will have more slides on the automatic nervous system, and then we will make some a bigger description and more conclusions from that. Okay, now parts of the nervous system, anatomical parts of the nervous system. Traditionally in textbooks, we begin from the brain. The brain is in the skull. See in this picture it is shown in pink, that's the brain cortex, and deeper layers are shown in lighter or darker brown. So the top part of the brain, shown pink here, is called the cerebrum. And the cerebrum, basically, it's a huge mass of nerve cells, trillions of nerve cells. The top part of the cerebrum, especially, is the brain cortex. That's the purely human part of the brain, cerebral cortex. That's the part of the brain that we use for thinking, verbal communication, speech, mathematical reasoning, abstract reasoning, etc., etc., etc. Then, if you go deeper, there is this so-called animal part of the brain. It's the subcortical region of the cerebrum. So everything that is shown pink here, but is deeper in the brain. Then the midbrain, thalamus. You see there's an arrow pointing at the thalamus, at the center. Hypothalamus, it's the area underneath the thalamus. And cerebellum, it's the part of the brain which is deeper and to the back of the thalamus. And the last third part of the brain, it's called a vegetable part of the brain, or there is a scientific term for it, brain stem. It consists of two parts: the pons, you see the arrow pointing at the pons, and the medulla. In older textbooks, medulla oblongata; in other textbooks, simply medulla. These two components of the brain stem are responsible for the most basic functions of the organism. For example, breathing. Right? There are breathing centers in the pons and in the medulla. uh, the tonus of the blood vessels, right? So circulation, uh, 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 digestion, uh, metabolism, and these parts of these very, very basic functions are under the control of the brain stem. Uh, you've probably heard the term persistent vegetative state, right? It happens when a person is in some accident or otherwise receives a very strong trauma of or experiences very strong trauma of the brain when the cerebrum and the midbrain, the thalamus, the hypothalamus, are dead, right? So there's the term brain dead, but the stem is still alive, and if that is so, the person is not dead because the breathing occurs as it should, uh, the circulatory system functions, and the person is able to swallow food, digest it, and tissues, cells of this individual will perform the metabolism necessary for subsistence. So it's not quite death, right? But because the other more developed, more advanced areas of the brain are dead, this person will never think clearly, this person will never communicate verbally, will never read, will never recognize particular objects, etc., etc., or at least we will not know whether this person recognizes them or not, but most likely the person will not recognize them. So that's the function of the brain stem. Uh, a little bit more about the midbrain. What is that for? The animal part of the brain. It is responsible for kind of functions that we share with animals. Appetites, appetite for food, appetite for sex. These are basically in the midbrain, in the thalamus especially. Cravings, cravings for sweet, for example. It's a part of the function of the thalamus, which better would be under the, you know, repressive control of the upper regions of the brain. Uh, Addictions also. Addictions are they are something that is directed by the midbrain, especially thalamus. Uh, Again, addictions normally can be suppressed because there is like a negative feedback coming from the upper areas, from the cerebrum, which repress the cravings and addictions. And reward-seeking behavior, you know, and an animal, if you watched your pet dog, for example, it will do something to get treats. And so the dog is seeking reward. And we have a similar function, which is something that the midbrain is responsible for. One kind of separate word about the cerebellum. Some anatomists, physiologists consider it part of the brain stem. Other consider it part of the midbrain. But in any under any circumstances, what cerebellum is for? Basic coordination of movement. Right? If one gets serious trauma of the cerebellum, the person cannot stand straight, right? Because the muscles of the back are not coordinated. They can relax, and the person bends down and eventually falls down. Also, during the walk, the cerebellum coordinates the work of the legs, etc. So actually, it's it's more of an animal function than just a vegetable function, but anatomically, maybe it is right to classify it as part of the brain stem. So that's basically about your brain. And again, remember that the brain consists of trillions of separate nerve cells which communicate between each other, send impulses to each other, activate each other, or suppress other nerve cells, etc. So the brain is very actively working and performing all these functions. Oh, also one very important word about the hypothalamus. It's also a part of the midbrain. Below the thalamus, you see the arrow points and it says pituitary gland. It doesn't really show the hypothalamus, but hypothalamus is between the pituitary gland and the thalamus. And the hypothalamus is something that regulates the endocrine function. Many hormones, particularly hormones produced by the pituitary gland, are under the control of hypothalamus. And hypothalamus works in a way like a clock. We mentioned it in a lecture about the reproductive system. The female reproductive cycle is very much under the control of the hypothalamus. Remember, in the first part of the female menstrual cycle, the hypothalamus tells the pituitary gland, produce follicle-stimulating hormone. Then events unwind and come to the point when the ovulation occurs, and again the hypothalamus tells the pituitary gland, okay, now stop, don't produce follicle-stimulating hormone anymore, it's not needed, produce luteinizing hormone. And the pituitary gland obeys, and the luteinizing hormone stimulates the production of progesterone, which prepares the uterus for implantation. And we can find in the literature some other examples of hypothalamus working like a clock. From here to here, do this. From this checkpoint in time, stop doing this, do that. And so that's how hypothalamus works. Just some basic information about the nerve cells. They're called neurons. The cells that generate and transmit nerve impulses, very important thing. The nervous system operates as a signaling system. And to generate the signal and to transmit it, that's the function of neurons. No other cells can do that. The membrane of muscle cells is also capable of generating impulses which are similar to nerve impulses. But plenty of other cell types, bone cells, skin cells, blood cells, etc., are not able to generate and transmit nerve impulses. Cells of the connective tissue, which are usually surrounding neurons, in this picture, see there is an arrow pointing at a cell painted yellow, and it says Schwann cell. Schwann cell is not a part of the nervous system per se. It's not a neuron. It's actually something that belongs to the connective tissue, and it wraps around the neuron, but it does not generate or transmit nerve impulses. It has other functions. Only neurons do generate and transmit nerve impulses. Now, see, there are separate parts shown here. Each neuron has the following parts. It has a body. It's a simple, like, cellular body with cytoplasm, nucleus inside, etc. Short appendages called dendrites. Dendrum in Latin is tree or branch. So they are called dendrites because they are like trees or maybe shrubs with many branches. That's the feature of a dendrite. And it's opposite to that. There is one very long appendage. You see it covered with Schwann cells, but if you look between Schwann cells, you see there are breaks, and you see this blue pieces of this long appendage. It's called axon. And axon, uh, there are some axons that may be like almost like a yard long or so, very, very, very long appendages. The axons at the end, they have the so-called axon terminal where the axon branches. It becomes almost like a dendrite, right? But dendrites don't have this long part, which is characteristic for axon. Why is it necessary to know these anatomical parts of the neuron? Because there's one golden rule in neurobiology, how the signaling works in the nervous system. The nerve impulse is generated in the dendrites, remember, then it is transmitted from the dendrite to the body of the neuron, and then from the body of the neuron down the axon, all the way to the axon terminal. And please be aware of that. The other direction is inconceivable, impossible. In the nervous system, there is not one single neuron where the impulse will go from the axon terminal up the axon to the body and to the dendrites. Only from the dendrites to the body, to the axon, all the way to the terminal of the axon. And it is important to understand the basics of the reflex. Remember, we said in the sensory part of the reflex, the impulses go from the receptor via the sensory neuron to the central nervous system. Then impulses go from the central nervous system to the motor neurons, and via the motor neurons to the organs, for example, to a muscle. They go in this direction. It is impossible to reverse this direction of the signaling. The sensory nerve principally will not signal from the brain back to the receptor, and the motor nerve will principally not signal from the muscle back to the brain. The nerves consist of neurons which obey this basic law of direction of the signaling from the dendrite to body to axon terminal, never the other way. So the transmission of nerve impulses is unidirectional, always in one particular direction, never in both. Now, just a little bit about the nature of the nerve impulse. If you sign up for my human anatomy and physiology class, I will tell you a lot more about the nature of the nerve impulse or action potential. But just the very basics. The nerve impulse by its nature is the electrical message. And so it has to do with charges, voltage, electric current, again going in a certain direction, etc. It is transmitted down the axon of a neuron. It says here the impulse is generated at points along the axon. I would modify this. It's not quite accurate. It is generated in the dendrites, not in the points along the axon. It's just that the impulse in certain neurons, not in all neurons, but in particular neurons, which have these Schwann cells wrapping around them. The impulse generated in the dendrites and then transmitted to the body is transmitted from the body to the axon, but it jumps from one gap between the two Schwann cells to the next, to the next, to the next. So in a way you can view it as generation of impulse at at points along the axon, but it's not. I don't like in this context. I don't like the word generated. Uh, jumps from one gap to the next, but impulses are not really originating from the axon. They originate from the dendrite. Uh, Very important to realize that the speed of nerve impulses, you see in this slide, gives you a range. Ranges from approximately 1 meter, or yard, per second to 100 meters or yards per second. Imagine this 100 yards per second speed. It's really fantastic. Why such a range? Because of the Schwann cells. Schwann cells produce a substance called myelin. Myelin, uh, natural color of myelin is white. The natural color of bodies of neurons is gray. Right? So in the brain, in the cerebrum especially, you distinguish between the gray matter and the white matter. The gray matter is bodies of neurons. The white matter is axons covered by myelin produced by Schwann cells. And when a neuron is, we say myelinated, when Schwann cells form and surround it, wrap around it, and produce their product myelin, then the speed of the transmission of the nerve impulse is enhanced greatly. Myelinated nerves work much faster than non-myelinated nerves. Two things. Why is this important again to know? First, myelination is a function of age. In small kids, most neurons are not myelinated. Right? So in them, the transmission of nerve impulse may be slower, substantially slower than in adults. And not all kids grow in the same way. So you can have a group of kids who are, for example, 2 years old or 3 years old, and they have already finished the myelination. So they transmit nerve impulses fast. And a group of kids of the same age, 2 years, 3 years, who just by their, I don't know, genetics or whatever, haven't yet completed myelination. They may seem kind of slow because they're, again, non-myelinated nerves signal slower. And it doesn't mean that they are dumb or retarded or something. They are just what they are. And in a year or 2 years or 3 years, when myelination will be completed, there will be no difference between these two groups. The other reason why it's important to remember about this transmission of nerve impulses in myelinated and non-myelinated neurons, there is a disease called multiple sclerosis. You probably heard about it. It's a very severe autoimmune disease when the immune system of the person, of the patient, destroys its own, his or her own, this person's own myelin. Myelin is actually a mixture of proteins and lipids, and the major part of this mixture is a protein called MBP, major myelin protein. It's the target of the immune system in patients with multiple sclerosis. So basically, it destroys this myelin basic protein, and the entire myelin sheath goes off, and the Schwann cells cannot restore the myelin sheath. So some nerves are more prone to this demyelination than others. And because of that, patients with multiple sclerosis, unless they receive good immunosuppressive therapy, unless they receive glucocorticoid hormones, remember, they are suppressing immunity. If they don't receive this treatment, they seem slow, their speech is slurred, their movements are clumsy, etc. By the way, their intellect works just fine. Multiple sclerosis does not affect the brain cortex, but peripheral neurons, which normally must be myelinated, are not, and this leads to these uh, symptoms. It is accountable for these symptoms. Uh, one extremely important part of the nervous system, the synapse. The synapse is the nervous system's relay station. Relay, like, the term relay race. Athletes are running, holding a stick, and then they arrive to the place where the next group of athletes stands and waits for the stick, and they give the stick to that second group. So they just kind of relay the message, and then the second group starts running, etc., etc. So the synapses are the relay station. Basically, a synapse is the connection between the end of the axon of a neuron and the membrane of another cell. Note that I'm not saying the membrane of another neuron, because it made the second cell to which the message is relayed. It may be a neuron, or it may be a cell of a muscle, or it may be a cell of a gland. So three kinds of these cells that receive the stick. They receive the relay, or the message is relayed to them. It's another neuron, muscle, or gland. And usually, in like 99.9% of the cases, a synapse consists of the presynaptic cell, always a neuron, the postsynaptic cell, so to which the message is relayed, a neuron or muscle or gland, and a space between them. And space is very narrow, but still it's a gap, it's an empty space. It's not filled with any cellular or acellular material. It's just a space between the two parts of the synapse, presynaptic cell and postsynaptic cell. About 0.1% or less of synapses are not like this. They don't contain the synaptic cleft, right? This empty space between the two cells. In them, the presynaptic cells simply contact the postsynaptic cell. That's a rarity, and we will discuss them further. Again, in my human anatomy and physiology class, we will have more discussions about that. So how do synapses work? If you look at this presynaptic cell on top, it's a neuron, and what you see is actually an axon terminal. And there are little vesicles in this axon terminal. See, the arrow points to one of them. It's a storage vesicle. What do these vesicles store? Special substances called neurotransmitters. Now, these substances are actively produced by all neurons, actually regardless of whether they transmit nerve impulses or not. It's just one basic function of a neuron is to synthesize, make these neurotransmitters and store them in the storage vesicles. When the nerve impulse reaches the end of the axon terminal, right, what happens is that the cell releases neurotransmitters. So you see in this picture there are two storage vesicles at the very end of the axon terminal, or at the border with the synaptic cleft. Look, they are kind of like bursting open, and their substances that were stored in them are released in one of these vesicles. little circles and in the other little triangles, but they are both neurotransmitters, just two different kinds of neurotransmitters. Neuron can produce dozens of types of neurotransmitters. Then the neurotransmitters make the postsynaptic cell develop and transmit its own impulses. One kind of word of caution there, that applies to the situation when the postsynaptic cell is another neuron or a muscle. If it's a gland, cells of glands cannot develop and transmit their own impulses, but still they do respond to neurotransmitters in some other way. So we say that the neurotransmitters make the postsynaptic cell develop and transmit its own impulses or develop some other effect. There is this saying that modern neurobiology is actually a science of about neurotransmitters, because the electrical phenomena that unwind during the generation and transmission of nerve impulses, they are like studied to death. They're very well known. On the other hand, this chemistry of the work of the nervous system, the chemistry of the brain, that's a less explored area, and this is probably the future. The more we know about neurotransmitters, the better we are in controlling possible diseases. I give you guys a short list of neurotransmitters. You don't have to remember each name, but you might as well remember and know basically what these neurotransmitters do. Acetylcholine. You might have heard about acetylcholine. It's the major neurotransmitter acting in the synapses between neurons and muscle cells. Right? Acetylcholine excites the muscles, or skeletal muscles. In the heart, however, it's different. It's also a major neurotransmitter between neurons and heart muscle cell membranes. But in the case of the heart, it depresses, right, or inhibits the function of the heart muscle cell, so it slows down the heart. Adrenaline, it's a neurotransmitter responsible for stress. Right? We will talk later about the so-called synaptic branch of the autonomic nervous system, which works under stress. It uses predominantly adrenaline as its neurotransmitter. Adrenaline is also a hormone. Remember, the medulla of the adrenal gland produces large quantities of adrenaline when we are stressed out. Serotonin, it's an interesting neurotransmitter. It acts only in the brain, never in the periphery, never between a neuron and a muscle, or a neuron and another neuron outside of the brain, only in the brain. And it is a major part of the getting pleasure from the world, so to say. People with normal production and normal reception of serotonin in the brain have a sort of a positive outlook on the world around them, and the impairment of normal reception of serotonin by postsynaptic cells in the brain is to a very large extent responsible for depression. Then dopamine, kind of opposite to some inhibitory neurotransmitters. It is also the neurotransmitter that works predominantly in the brain, not much in the periphery. And just like serotonin, it is responsible for the positive outlook, for feeling good, for sensations of satisfaction, etc. One kind of interesting thing about dopamine is that you probably heard about the Parkinson disease, right? In patients with Parkinson disease, the production of dopamine is very low. And naturally it causes depression, but it also uh, shows in the periphery uh, this particular tremor of the extremities, especially hands. Right? It's because of the low dopamine in the brain and in the peripheral synapses. Endorphins, we'll have a separate slide about endorphins. Nitric oxide, remember when did we mention nitric oxide? It is a neurotransmitter and it is produced by neurons in what organs? Remember, the penis and the clitoris, right, in the erectile tissue. Uh, and others, there are probably several dozens of neurotransmitters that are being actively studied, but I will not go into depth here. So just remember the basic thing about the synapse, that it's the place where the nerve impulse pushes the presynaptic cell to release neurotransmitters. And then these neurotransmitters act on the postsynaptic cell, causing some effect, contraction of the muscle, generation and transmission of nerve impulses by the postsynaptic cell if it is a neuron, or change in the rate of secretion, for example, if the postsynaptic cell is a gland. I told you that we will have a special kind of look at synapses as sites of disease, depression. Depression is a disease of synapses. See, the left part of the picture shows you two neurons in the brain, one presynaptic, the other postsynaptic. And normally, when in the presynaptic neuron, when the nerve impulse reaches the tip of the axon or the axon terminal, these vesicles containing neurotransmitters open up and neurotransmitters land on the membrane of the postsynaptic neuron, doing something, causing some effect. It may be generation of a nerve impulse and transmission of this impulse by the postsynaptic neuron. In some cases, it may be inhibition of signaling by the second postsynaptic neuron. But in any case, it's a certain effect. Now, in what you see in the right part of the slide, typical situation of the so-called chemical depression. Imagine that these yellow-colored balls in the storage vesicle to the left, they are serotonin, right? And look, when the nerve impulse reaches the tip of the presynaptic axon, serotonin is released from the synaptic, from the storage vessel in the presynaptic neuron. But then, see this arrow, the kind of curved arrow shows that it goes back. It is taken up by the presynaptic neuron. So the postsynaptic neuron receives less of a serotonin. Or imagine that the green neurotransmitter is dopamine, same thing. It is released from the presynaptic neuron, but then taken back by the presynaptic neuron. So this reuptake of neurotransmitters, especially reuptake of serotonin, is very well known to doctors, psychiatrists especially, and there are actually drugs that help in this case. There are drugs that specifically inhibit this reuptake of serotonin. Prozac was the first drug of this series, then Paxil, Zoloft, etc., etc. Now they are very popular. They're basically all the same, but with little variation in their effect. Well, the people who are depressed, usually they do feel some relief. Their mood improves, their vision of the world becomes brighter, etc., etc. Although it's not always the case. I remember I heard from one psychiatrist who said that to inhibit the reuptake of serotonin is kind of like increase the brightness of the screen of your TV, right? If you are a smart, hard-working person with good work ethic, etc., and you are in the state of chemical depression, uh, increasing the brightness of the screen improves your condition, you become more positive, you become happier, etc., etc. And if you are a stupid person, if you are a person who has poor work ethic, who cannot really perform any work, is lazy, etc., we sometimes give antidepressants and we see the opposite effect because, again, it's like turning the brightness of the TV screen up, but in this case, the person just sees better how miserable and how stupid this person is, right? So neurotransmitters are not universal healers of depression. They help those who really want to get out of depression by doing something productive. Uh, okay, so that's chemical depression. And one thing that I want you guys to carry, like a take-home message, please remember that depression is a serious disease. It is an impairment of brain chemistry. So when you see someone who is obviously depressed, don't hurry to blame this person, to tell the other people that this person, oh, he's hopeless, he's always in a bad mood, he's just a jerk, stay away from him. So usually these people need help, they need drugs, they need antidepressants, and they can improve if they get this antidepressant therapy, especially in combination with word therapy by a psychiatrist or medical psychologist. Uh, Endorphins. Again, I promised to give you a special uh, talk about endorphins. Endorphins are natural analogs of opiates. You definitely heard about opiates. Nowadays we experience the epidemics of opiates. People abuse opiates. Chemical opiates are actually derivatives of poppy seed, etc. Some their plant origin, and well, they are pain killers. They relieve pain, and they cause the sensation of high, which very quickly causes dependence and addiction, etc. Then the endorphins are natural opioids. They are produced in the brain, and unlike opiates from poppy seed or other plants, chemically synthesized opiates, they do not cause dependence and do not harm the organism. They are natural ingredients of brain chemistry. They are neurotransmitters by their physiology. They act in brain synapses on postsynaptic cells, and the result of the endorphins' action on the postsynaptic cell is the sense of joy, accomplishment, and what athletes sometimes call second wind. Right? And also there is an expression, runner's high. Athletes who run, especially long distances, they know this sensation that when they run, they get tired, physically exhausted. They feel the shortness of breath. They struggle with it, and their pace slows down, etc. Then suddenly they see a finish line ahead. So their brain rejoices. It gives the command to endorphins, or to neurons that produce endorphins, to produce endorphins. And endorphins cause what is called second wind. Endorphins act on the diaphragm, the muscle that regulates breathing, and intercostal muscles that also regulate breathing. And literally causes they cause the sensation that everything is okay. I can breathe. I can breathe again. I have the second wind, and it is very helpful to some extent. And by the way, also this running high, because endorphins are also painkillers, like all opioids. The running high may be kind of dangerous because there were cases when a runner had some little rock in her or his uh, shoe, and because of the increased production of endorphins, the runner did not feel pain. The endorphins are very powerful pain relievers. And then when she or he arrived to the finish and sat down on the grass, suddenly there's this pain, and she or he looks at the foot and sees blood. Right? So that's sometimes how the runner's high conceals the agents that can cause really serious pain. Now, what you see in this picture, there are some chemicals that stain areas of the brain cortex which are under the control of endorphins. And you see the brain of the person to the left is the brain after sitting quietly. Then the brain shown on the right, it's the brain of a person after just 20-minute walk. Look at the difference. Right? The endorphins are produced in larger quantities and by a bigger number of neurons in the brain. So life's simple pleasures like walking, running, swimming, bicycling, chopping wood, sailing, diving, even hugging. When you hug some person who is your friend or your loved one, you have a steep rise in the production of endorphins in the brain. And a little bit about the autonomic nervous system deserves a special discussion. Again, recall what is the autonomic nervous system. It's part of the motor nervous system in the peripheral nervous system, which does not work under your conscious will. You cannot command the autonomic nervous system to increase your heart rate or to open up your arteries, etc. But sympathetic and parasympathetic nerves do that without your conscious will, without the work of your brain cortex, actually, without you thinking about it. The major difference between these two branches of the autonomic nervous system, sympathetic and parasympathetic. The sympathetic nerves work under stress or during stress. I always tell my human anatomy and physiology students that to get an idea about what sympathetic nervous system is for, imagine the tiger in the room. You are sitting at the table with your friend. You have lunch together. It's a nice, good meal, and you are savoring it, and you're engaged in a pleasurable conversation, blah blah blah. And then suddenly you see a tiger in the corner. Is it the time to savor your meal and continue the pleasant talk with a friend? No, it's time to run for your life, right? Or if you are in the jungle somewhere and you have a spear, throw the spear and kill the tiger. But in both cases, it's stress, right? It's an acute mobilization of your body for doing something which is life-changing thing. It's like do or die. So these sympathetic nerves, all of them are involved in this coping of the body with the stress. Their main neurotransmitter is adrenaline. And the goal of the sympathetic system generally is to concentrate the organism on supplying the brain with blood highly enriched with oxygen and glucose. Right? Uh, in this picture, you see all these particular effects of sympathetic nerves, but there's one common denominator. All of these effects work toward the same goal. Give your brain more food in the form of arterial blood rich in oxygen and rich in nutrients, especially glucose. Right? So the sympathetic nerves stimulate the production and release of glucose. That they increase the heart rate and elevate the blood pressure and push this blood to the brain by all means. It's not the time to worry much about your blood pressure. In this case, it's useful. It will give more food to your brain and help you make these momentary decisions. It makes your bronchi, or they, sympathetic nerves, make your bronchi wide, dilate your bronchi, dilate your pupils. Then the sympathetic nerves also, no, this is important, inhibit the digestive system. So I mentioned savoring a tasty meal. If there is tiger in the room and your sympathetic nervous system is mobilized, you will not have much appetite. First of all, your salivary glands will stop producing saliva. And the dry mouth, very common symptom of stress. Then your stomach will produce less of the gastric juice. The intestine and the pancreas, the liver will produce less of their secretions. Right? There will be a decrease and inhibition in the function of digestive enzymes and so on and so forth. Also, the sympathetic nerves can inhibit erection, right, and stimulate ejaculation during sexual act. Right, again, the same goal. It's not the right time. There's tiger in the room. It's not the right time to have pleasurable, intimate marital relations. If you are having them, you better finish them fast and run for your life. So that's the work of the sympathetic branch. And then the parasympathetic branch, the exact opposite. Parasympathetic nerves work to relieve the body from stress. So imagine that you are at this lunch table with your friend and the tiger, for some reason, ran away. It hardly happens in real life, especially if the tiger is hungry. It will attack you. But just imagine that it's a strange, peace-loving tiger and it just ran away. And so there's no more stress. Now is the time to enjoy your lunch and to talk with your friend, being relaxed, right? The neurotransmitters which are employed by parasympathetic nerves, a wide variety of them, but not adrenaline. The goal is to provide rest and relaxation. And to this end, all the particular effects of the parasympathetic nerves work. They stimulate the digestive tract. Right? The stomach will produce more gastric juice. The pancreas will produce its secretions, which have, if you remember, digestive enzymes like trypsin, lipase, etc. The liver will produce and release less glucose, but it will produce and release bile. And bile is important for digestion of lipids, so that's the right time to do it. The parasympathetic nerves will also make your bronchi narrower. Right? There's no more need to load and load and load your blood with oxygen because, well, it has a certain amount of oxygen, so it's kind of normal. It will make your pupils narrow, right? You don't need that much light coming into your eye. And erection can be stimulated by the parasympathetic nerves. Remember, this nitric oxide It is produced in the parasympathetic nerves under the influence of centers of the parasympathetic nervous system. And ejaculation, the other way around, it is inhibited by the parasympathetic nervous system. Uh, so it's now time for all kinds of pleasurable activities which you do when you are in the state of rest and relaxation. Normally, there must be some balance between both branches of the autonomic nervous system. That's the ideal homeostasis. But of course, when there is tiger in the room, forget about balance. Be stressed. It might save your life. And special senses. Usually, in all textbooks, it's the concluding part of the discussion about the nervous system. We have general senses, right? We have the sensation of touch, we have sense of pain, we have sense of temperature, etc. They're simple senses. But there are also some special senses which have a somewhat more complicated physiology. Special senses, what are they? They are smell, taste, vision, hearing, and one more, people say touch. No, equilibrium. Touch is a simple sense. Equilibrium is a special sense. It is actually the feeling that your body is in the right position and there is a special organ in your inner ear which is responsible for that. And in this slide you see how the sensation of smell and the sensation of taste work. Again, everything begins from a receptor. The top part, the upper left corner of this picture shows you receptors of smell. They are in the nose, right, in the mucosal on the mucosal surface of the nose. They react to the so-called odorants. What are odorants? It's really difficult to say. Whatever you can smell is an odorant. So a very wide variety of chemicals, etc. So these odorants are what triggers, disturbs your receptors of smell. Then what happens when the receptor is activated? It generates the action potential or nerve impulse, and this nerve impulse is propagated or transmitted to the brain, and not just to the brain, but to a special area in the brain. Look, there is this yellow body at the border between the nasal cavity and the brain, and it's called olfactory bulb, right? It's a collection of neurons. Then there is olfactory tract. It's the collection of axons of these neurons, and it goes all the way to the so-called olfactory cortex. In this slide, it is notated as the primary olfactory cortex, but that's small details. We can just call it olfactory cortex. So a special area or region in the brain cortex which is specifically responsible for smell. And then the image of the smell is kind of integrated, synthesized in this olfactory cortex. Receptors of taste, very similar mode of operation. They are called also taste buds, right? But just like receptors of smell, just like receptors of taste, they are neurons, basically, slightly modified neurons. When they are triggered, they just do what all neurons do: generate and propagate or transmit nerve signals. But what triggers them? Substances that have a taste, right? That's why you can tell bitter from sour, etc. And there are certain chemical entities that are responsible for particular tastes. For example, there are taste buds that react to an excess of hydrogen ions. If you recall from Bio2, pH, right, acidity, alkalinity. Acidity means excess of hydrogen ions, free hydrogen ions. So there are taste buds that detect that, and your brain synthesizes the image of a sour taste. Then there are other buds that are reacting to hydroxyl ions, OH minus. Right? They are opposite of hydrogen ions, and they are responsible for bitter taste. Uh, Yet other taste buds are triggered by sugar, simply sugar in your food, and that's why you feel the sensation of sweet. Or sodium and chloride ions, and you perceive salty taste. Then what happens next? From the tongue, from the taste buds, the nerve impulse goes to, again, see all the way, follow all the way this green arrow. It goes to the thalamus and then again to the brain cortex, and uh, it the impulse actually lands in a special area that is called caudal uh, olfac orbital cortex, or uh, uh, gustatory cortex. Also, gustation is the same as tasting. Gustatory cortex. We can call it caudal orbital cortex or gustatory cortex. But just remember that, again, it's a specialized area in the cortex responsible specifically for generation of the taste, sensation of the taste. Vision. Vision, this is the part when very many students have sort of wrong basic ideas and get confused. The first issue always when we discuss senses, and generally the work of the nervous system, what's the receptor of vision? Where are, or receptors in plural, there's more than one kind, and where are they? And every semester in my human anatomy and physiology course, I have students who write in their quizzes or even in their exam, sometimes even in their final exam, they say, my receptor of vision is my pupil. And actually what pupil is, it's nothing. It's a hole. It's an empty space. So it's a hole that allows the light to enter the chambers of the eyeball, but it's in no way it is a receptor of anything. The receptors of vision are in the very back of the eyeball, in the so-called retina, right? That's uh, the part of the eyeball which is the furthest from the pupil, from the frontal part of the eye. What is the function of the pupil and of the organ called lens, which is behind the pupil? Simply to allow the light to enter the eye and to focus this light to the area where these receptors are, where the number of these vision receptors is the biggest. In this picture, you see an arrow pointing at an area of the retina called fovea, and in the parenthesis it says point of central focus. There are other names for this area we'll see in the next slide, but whatever you name it, it's the part of the cortex where you have the biggest number of vision receptors, and that's where the light should be concentrated, and that's the function of the pupil, and especially the lens. The lens can really work like an optical lens. It can change its shape, and so it can focus the light coming from objects that are near the eye or further from the eye. By changing this shape, it changes the focus, and that is called accommodation. But again, please let us agree and remember, basically, for the end of this course, at least for the final exam, but better for the rest of your lives, remember that the receptors of vision are special neurons that are located in the retina of the eye, in the very back of the eyeball. When these receptors are triggered, they're triggered by light, by photons, particles, elementary particles that make up the light beams. They signal to the brain via the so-called optic nerve. It's one of the largest nerves in the body. You see very thick cord coming from the eye. It contains axons of millions of neurons, millions of cells, bodies of which are in the retina, actually. And the signal goes via this optical neuron to the brain, but again, to a particular part of the brain which is responsible for synthesizing visual images, the visual cortex. Then let's take a little bit closer look at the receptors of vision. I said that you should use the plural because there's more than one kind of them, right? And indeed, there are two kinds of visual receptors. You have visual receptors that are called rods, and you have another kind of visual receptors that are called cones. These names come from their morphology, simply their shape. Rods are more elongated, and cones, they resemble an ice cream cone, actually. So these two kinds of receptors. Note that they are both cells. They are cells. They are modified neurons, related to neurons. And they are capable of generating and transmitting nerve impulses. Why these two kinds? They have somewhat different functions. Rods are more sensitive to light. So rods work when you are in a dark room, or when you are going down a path in the woods and the sun goes down and it's twilight and the night, but you still have some visual images, right? And that's the work of the rods. They are extremely sensitive. Even small amounts of light actually trigger them. Cones are very different. They are not as sensitive. They require actually lots of light to function. But they are responsible for sharp visual images. Right? So when you see something and it's blurry, it means that cones are not really involved. When you see something and it looks sharp, having sharp contours, etc., you see, I see it very well. That's because the cones are working. Now, both types of cells, rods and cones, are in the retina, but rods are evenly distributed along the retina. The eyeball is round, but any point you point to the back of the eyeball, the part of which is the furthest from the pupil, point at any place in the retina, there will be some rods there. Cones are not like this. They're concentrated in a special area, in a place called macula. Full name macula lutea in Latin, and in literal translation it means yellow spot. In the previous slide you saw an arrow pointing at something that is called fovea, but I prefer to use the term macula. It's more accurate because macula is a spot, right? And it really gives you an idea of some like spot, a stain or something which is on the retina. That's where the cones are, right? And from this you can deduce that the role of the pupil and especially the lens is to make sure that the light that your eye receives goes to this spot, to this macula. If it misses the macula, if the focusing is not done properly, you still see things, but they're blurry, they're not sharp. So people who have myopia, like myself, without correction glasses, we see blurry images. People who have hypermetropia or farsightedness, like my wife, also they need correction glasses because otherwise they see blurry images. The focusing doesn't work. The accommodation does not work properly. The light is not focused on the yellow spot, on the macula lutea. One more thing, to function, both rods and cones need a special substance which is called rhodopsin. Rhodopsin is a unique substance. It is a combination of a protein and a pigment, kind of like hemoglobin, but it doesn't have the red color hemoglobin. It doesn't have any color, actually, but the pigment which is in the rhodopsin is the place that is specifically reacting to photons, to the particles of light. Right? So no rhodopsin, no vision. So vision begins with landing of photons on the pigment part of the rhodopsin. If you don't have it, then you are blind. You don't see anything. And one important part, to make rhodopsin, your body, your organism, needs vitamin A. The opsin, the pigment part of rhodopsin, the non-protein part of rhodopsin, it is essentially vitamin A. And vitamin A is not made in your body. You have to get it with diet. And so you need to get foods that are rich in vitamin A. You know what food is the richest in vitamin A? You won't believe it. Carrots. Right? Then fish oil, a good size of good source of vitamin A. Liver. Americans don't like liver of animals or fishes, poultry, etc. But in Asian countries, it's very popular, and in Eastern Europe, it's a very popular meal, actually fried or roasted liver of a cow or swine. It's actually very tasty, and it is a rich source of vitamin A. Okay, so this concludes our discussion about the nervous system. The quiz on the nervous system will be after your second midterm exam. This material actually goes into your third midterm and your final exams. Please study these slides carefully and do that with your textbook open and compare with the textbook. Some things that are in the textbook, I personally thought that that's too much detail for an introductory course, so I skipped that, so don't worry about that. But if you see something in the book that I also talked about, mentioned, please study that. It's important. Don't just look at these slides and think that you know everything. Study these slides and study the material in the textbook. And you'll be fine. Okay, you will produce a lot of endorphins and you will feel you will feel satisfied. Okay, thank you. See you soon.